All right, so thank you everyone. It's good to see you. um, this week we were focusing on ethics, methods, and writing. And so you had a couple of the readings you did, one on kind of ethical issues in conducting research, which the one by Clifford Drew. And that one, I hope it's something, that'll be helpful kind of as you continue to go forward as kind of a resource to come back to. Definitely recommend coming back to it as you're developing your research proposal down the road here in a short bit for the course, but also just has some good reminders in it in general. So I think, that's one to kind of really hold on to as much as possible. And then the reading by Jean Simonelli about the active voice. And so I wanted to kind of go through oh, hello, Maher, and talk through a bit from the community discussion forum of, I'd like to start out in some of the, we'll start in breakout groups just for about 10-15 minutes or so, and discuss kind of your main key takeaways that you really shared from the discussion forum. As a reminder, it posed the questions of having constant attention to both narrative and voice are crucial in participatory action research. And in particular, the reading this week by Simonelli exemplifies the negotiation of narrative and voice throughout the ethnographic research process. And so I'd asked, as you read, that to pay attention to examples of how that ethnographic perspective bears on the sharing of kind of what we can understand as like control of the research and its narrative. And so some of the questions posed, and I'll put this into the chat, were based on Simonelli's writing. How is reflection shared? How is consent informed? How is the formation of the research question deliberated? What theoretical concepts are tested? And how does the style of writing reflect the community's relationship? Taking special note of sensory details that she recorded in the writing and what those details contribute to your ability to relate to the communities described. And so there's a lot to kind of unpack in a relatively short article, in the sense of we're thinking a lot about the ethics of research, the positionality of both the researcher and those participating, and the power dynamics. And then also there's a very distinct layer of how to tell the story as well, how to convey that research. In this sense, there was poetry composed, right? How she used that narrative voice. So kind of a lot to unpack in this short kind of bit here. And so what I'd like to do, I'm going to put you just into groups of 3, so in 2 groups, and I will put, once you're in the groups, I'll put in the chat those reminder of those prompts for the questions. And again, just for about 10 minutes, share out with your peers what your kind of key takeaways were from the writing and thinking about those prompts in particular. All right, so I will open up the breakout groups, and then I will put the prompts into the chat. So everyone's good to go? All right. I will see you back here in about 10-12 minutes. Oops. All right, hopefully can you guys access the rooms okay? Melcia, do you see where to join the room?
Yeah. I tried to join the room, but I see I returned the principal room.
Yeah, so if you join the one I did now, just I was trying to make the rooms even numbers.
Yeah, I tried to join the room one.
Yeah, if you can join room 2, just so the numbers are even. I think does it give you the option?
I I I, I joined the room one, but I didn't get in.
Yeah, are you able to join room 2?
There is no notice to join the room two.
Oh, so in my thing, it's showing that you're assigned to room 2. Let's see. So you don't have anything popping up for you to join the room?
No, in my screen there is no notice.
Okay, here, let me, here, Gunjan, we're going into breakout groups to
Okay.
kind of talk about our key takeaways from the discussion forum for this week. So I'm gonna put you into one of the groups. And then here, and then Milchiad, I'll try to figure out what is going on with yours. Let's see. Oh, there, no. All right, Melchia, do you have it popping up? Oh, yeah, no.
No.
Hi, hello, good evening.
Hi, Dorji. Here, let me, I'm gonna put the prompts in real quick for folks. Dorji, we're in breakout groups right now, talking about the key takeaways from the discussion forum.
Okay.
And so I'm gonna put you into one of the groups here. And now that's recording back up. So yeah, thank you all for sharing a bit. I'd love to hear if like anyone, in the groups would just like to share back kind of with the full group, if there are any kind of real kind of, I don't know if I want to say like aha moments, kind of that really key takeaway and shift in thinking about what is being put forward in Seminelli's reading about really thinking about the ethics of research, thinking about the responsibility of the researcher and their engagement with participants in an equal level. And so if anyone, from your own takeaways from the discussion together, if anyone has kind of any key points they would like to draw out to the group and share.
So I'll go. So in our discussion and also from my reflection, we talked about in my research experience, what we were doing, that we were including community as a part of our research, and then we were taking consent and everything. But then like from the reading, I also realized that we don't share our findings, or we don't document the findings together. What we do, we conduct research, we come up with our findings, and then we try to improve the project from that research. So we don't actually involve uh, the community, or we don't involve uh, the documentation process. So in our group also we were talking how can we and I think June also talked about that how can we document, or how can we involve our community in documenting this research process. That was the first that we discussed, and the second was about the informed consent. That though we talk about that we are taking informed consent from the community, but then how do we know that they're really, like, do they really know? Because then in my community, uh, the communities like are not literate. So then even if we talk about taking written consent, they just like, do they really know that what would be the consequences of the project or the research? So in terms of maybe psychological or social consequences, so are they really informed is something that we were discussing.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you raised that for, this is a challenge in most research contexts, and one is also just that, I mean, there's kind of a base level of just of having options for people of, if people aren't literate or aren't literate in the language that a consent's being written in, that there's also oral consent, and that is recorded. Saying that still, it may not be very clear to folks really what they're consenting to, and exactly as you shared, Gunjan, of what the risks could be. And so, this is part of the problem. An informed consent process was developed because of things that happen, say, through medical experiments and things in a fairly recent history as to how people really discriminated and experimented on. And so that was where this kind of human subject research came about, and doing this informed consent process, and which is helpful at a very, very, very bare minimum. And the problem with it is that folks think, okay, I've done that. I've gone through a human subjects research process. I've done an informed consent. My project is completely ethical. I'm good to go. That is the absolute bare minimum. That's what, for example, academic institutions, research institutions, other professional institutions, that's what they say, okay, to now, legally we're okay. And so the question is, in doing actual participatory research, is that enough? And so you need to have that, but it's more of a yes and, that you don't just stop there. And so as part of this course, and coming up in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking through kind of ideas around developing, for example, a declaration of principles, of guiding principles that are more kind of agreements and norms that are developed together with the community, that is working in two directions. It's calling out your responsibility and what you're going to adhere to as the researcher, and what they're agreeing to as participants in this, and that you're developing that together, as opposed to an informed consent form that you write as the researcher, often in language that's not very understandable to anyone really, right? And that you're asking someone to sign. And so this is where we have to think about, what does ethical consent really mean and look like? And I appreciate what Austin shared in the chat. Simonelli is portraying an attempt to break down decades of formality created by the research community. Absolutely. Anytime a new way of doing things causes people to lose power, there will most likely be a lot of pushback. Yes, also agreeing with Chris, that is a great concise summary of it. And so that we're thinking about, what are ways to kind of break through, when really what we're talking about, in a sense, is a kind of paradigm shift in research. That since Simonelli wrote this piece, she wrote it, gosh, I'm trying to remember, it's probably about 12, 13 years ago now, that there has been more movement in this direction. It's not there yet. So, where she was writing this from, like 13, 14 years ago, it was definitely further behind than today. However, the kind of research we're talking about engaging in, the problem is now it's become more common language to say, oh, I'm doing participatory research, which can become really dangerous too, because it can become kind of like a check mark, right? Like, we're just, I'm doing participatory research, even if we look at it, is it really different than kind of what's happening in traditional, typical research processes? And so a few things kind of I want to point out that really emerged from what all of you reflected on was thinking about this, the kind of main theme of this active involvement of people, and that their voice is leading. That Austin had shared, one of Simonelli's quotes was, we share the authorial voice with our community collaborators, and that this broke through the usual distinction of subject and object and allowed for a truly collaborative process of knowledge production. And Gunjan, you had, included in that same light, the importance of decentralizing the power in research. And that becomes really important to think about, really, of who holds the power. What does that dynamic look like? And a lot of this goes back to then who owns the data and information, and how is that curated, which we'll come to. And then, talking about this style of writing, right? The kind of narrative prose style, this poetry that was shared. Melchiad, you had reflected that kind of writing illustrates the community relationship, in the sense of, the working process can be viewed by those who have the power in the community and avoid bias towards them, right? So trying to address that kind of power dynamic through even just the style of the writing. Carissa, you had shared that the document in detail issues and problems that go beyond just this kind of cultural description, right? It creates this change in that narrative style. And again, the difference of who holds the power in place. And similarly, Gunjan, you share, the process of learning and documenting together, right? And that becomes really critical, is that it's not just this researcher documenting observations being made, it's a partnership of documenting together, which we think about, what does that look like in terms of data ownership and who owns the data. Austin, you called out, another quote from Simonelli about the communities we work with are no longer the benign participants of anthropological scrutiny. We have been asked to give up part of the control of the research endeavor, to learn and document together, to return to them with what we write. And that last point, return to them with what we write, that often traditionally the research process is seen as very distinct phases, okay, you're developing the research, the methodologies and the questions, and then you're doing the research, right? That's when participants are engaged, is when you're doing research on them, in a sense. And then you take that away and you go and analyze it and you write it up, and maybe what you have to produce for work, you have to produce a report or wherever that information has to go. If you have a government job and you're trying, what you're trying to do with it. What we're taking kind of break down there is going back to something Dr. Betsy Taylor shared with us that the second week of class, and we talked about that action research cycle, right? And even in that action research cycle, it's not really actually just this perfect circle, right? There's a lot of, it's not like a linear process. There's constant back and forth between these phases. So there isn't this, oh, okay, the research isolated, sitting alone, coming up with what's the perfect question. How do I get these? How do I get the data? And then going to the community, doing that research and then going away. That there's that continued engagement and iteration and deliberation throughout each step of that process, including the analysis, any sort of writing, any sort of product development. And that goes to, June had shared this idea, this whole process of community development is a, quote, as you shared, a development process, which includes that writing and reporting. And the community is not enough for just being a partner, but an owner in the process, and how deeply affected they are by these results. And we see that there's really distinct challenges in doing this kind of work, right? Chris has shared, one of the challenges is that, there are times when that researcher could be called out to take an explicitly active, sometimes biased role, right? Of you start, I've had this happen a lot in my research where someone, kind of a journalist or scientist kind of outside will ask me, well, are you a researcher or are you an activist? Are you a researcher or are you an advocate? And there can be a very fine line there, right? There's what I would, what's called kind of an advocacy anthropology, which is more what I engage in, that it's not saying you have to separate between these two worlds, because they're trying to create this notion that research is completely unbiased if you're, that if you're objective, if you're not engaged in it. And I would argue that it's going to be biased, right? That there's going to be subjectivity there, which is different than the kind of level of you being engaged in the work. Carissa, yeah.
We kind of talked about this in our group too, and I think Maher posed the question of like, what are our responsibilities or like moral responsibilities? And it was more of like that idea. And that kind of also made me think about, or I think, and feel free to jump in if I'm getting the question wrong. It was more of like, the answer would be, yeah, it feels like it's a moral responsibility to kind of, if people, when we talked about informed consent, like if the community members weren't understanding it, like, and it wasn't your research, but someone else was doing the research, like what would your role in that be? And I guess a question for you or just anyone else is like, is there kind of like a moral, like an ethical, because I'm thinking more of like psychology. If you're doing a test, there's like the standards that you have to follow and confidentiality and all things like that. And in this like community development, you would hope and think that everybody, has goals for the greater good, like very similar in that sense. But I'm just wondering, like, if maybe you've even personally faced that or seen it in your work where there has been a time where you were questioning like ethics of research, and were you able to address that, and like how did it go?
So one example I give, and I might have even mentioned this before, so you can stop me if I did, of thinking about, one problem is that also looking at who is funding the research and control that they have over that, what's being done in a sense, right? And so I say that, I think maybe I'd share this with Gunjan of, I was doing some, brought on to do some research in central India where these huge reinsurance companies around the world, they were funding this kind of global project of trying to understand migration patterns due to changes in rainfall. And this was deemed at the time a really leading participatory research project because people from the communities were engaged in developing what the results were, in a sense. But because of how the research was funded, it was said, okay, this is the question and this is what matters. This is what's important in this community, is that there's changes in migration patterns due to changes in rainfall. And in the communities that we were engaging with, while there were changes in migration patterns, there were significant changes in migration patterns that folks talked about. Yeah, there was a bit of shift. The rains were coming a bit earlier. They're lasting a bit longer, maybe. There was, monsoon season was changing a bit. But really the significance of the changes in their migration patterns was because of the coal-fired power plants being built around their communities. And that's what was killing their crops. And that's why they're moving. But because of the funding to do this research, even though it was labeled as participatory, the funding to do this research said, no, that's not the thing we're looking at. And so I submitted my statement as to why this is wrong and I wouldn't continue. So sometimes I'll say, that you also, sometimes you might be in a situation you don't hold all the power making those decisions either. You can make the statement and say this is wrong, for sure. But that it's also, that's why I say it goes back to being careful about what's being labeled as participatory as well, becomes really important, because as this becomes almost like a really sexy kind of term, and it's like now it's because it's becoming a little more, I don't want to say the norm, but there's a greater expectation because there's a lot more being put out there as to how research can be such an extractive endeavor, as to the kind of harms it can cause, that it's not where it should be, but there is still more pushback against that and more demand for there's, you know, in a lot of places, there's a big push towards, you know, what's called data sovereignty and ideas around ownership around data and who should control the data. It's a big problem, say, for example, in the US, where I'm doing a lot of my work now, a lot of federal agencies that say they have funding for what they would call underserved communities. These communities won't necessarily even go for that funding, even if they could, because when you read what's going to be done with that information and how it's going to be controlled and kind of taken out of their ownership. So there's a lot of concerns about even engaging in that. And so there's, I think, what kind of a long-winded way of saying there's also this notion, again, going back to what is the minimum kind of global research ideas. So, okay, you have to have some sort of consent, but is that the extent to go to if you're trying to do this moral responsibility? And so that's what we have to think about holding ourselves accountable to. Is that enough? Or what are the kinds of agreements being worked out with the community that's also holding you accountable as well? Because a lot of the form consent, it's one direction. You know, it's getting their permission. Whereas if you're creating an agreement together, it's what you're saying that you will also hold yourself accountable to. And often includes the full cycle of not just doing kind of going through the data collection, but then what happens with that information. How is the community participants engaged after the quote research is done, right? What access do they have to that information? This is a big problem where a lot of times, you know, communities are engaged and there's work being done, say for information, like, you know, communities might need some sort, you know, they're looking at certain indicators for shifts in climate and how that's affecting them, right? And there might be research done and now they have no access to it, right? How is that going to be helpful for them in developing plans to either adapt or mitigate to the situation if they now no longer have access to the data that they were informing because it's sitting in some computer and they can't access that system, right? And so these are very real challenges that people face, right? That have real consequences on their lives. I'd love to hear what others kind of think of that, and thinking about kind of and as Maher, you know, shared about kind of ideas around this moral responsibility. Maher, yeah.
Yes, for me, like the question why I ask this question, because honestly, in some communities, we see like many people conducting research or even like companies or like donors or different entities, but sometimes they don't like respect this like this moral and this ethical research, and they even sometimes, as I discussed with the group earlier, that even like they use like different language from the local language, and people sometimes they don't understand what is like the background of the research or what is like the objective of that one. So as a researcher or as someone at least who knows what is like ethical research, what will be our role even if we are not connected to that entity or to that community? If we see something strong or if wrong or mistake, do we have any kind of ethical responsibility?
And that's where, and there's, so, and we'll be reading here actually in a couple of weeks, it's a little tricky of, there's almost, when we think about things like hard law or soft law. So hard law is like, you know, legislation passed by your government, and if you break that rule, you could go to jail, right? Soft law is more like guidelines from the United Nations. You know, so for example, United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. If your country is a signatory to that, and they in a sense break those guidelines, this is more of an ethical stance, right? They're not gonna go to jail for it. So that's kind of the difference, right, between hard and soft law, which is in a similar vein to when we're talking about this participatory research process and what is this kind of idea of the informed consent and human subjects review that you have to do from and I'm not saying everywhere, in majority of places, majority of institutions, that's the agreed process, right? So if you break kind of what the agreement is in the human subjects review, if you haven't gone through it, or if you haven't done the informed consent, received kind of official approval, right, then you're held, that can hold you accountable. What we're talking about is in that soft law range, right, of that kind of moral responsibility that you have. And if you're going to make an agreement, a kind of, principles of agreement with a community, if that's broken, it's basically, it's a difference between kind of that legal obligation and that moral obligation. And this is a big problem in research, is that the moral obligation is only on you if you break it. And okay, what are the consequences? Maybe you've lost trust of that community. But there's, but now nothing's officially kind of legally stopping you, right? Unless saying that, there are more and more now where, and not always, but it's becoming a little more common, where communities will have their own process, right? Especially kind of sovereign communities will have their own process and their own agreed review, that instead of going through your institution, that community is saying, no, we actually have our official process. And that might include agreements that you're signing around data ownership. That could include their own type of consent. And for example, if this is a sovereign community, and if now there's two ways you could do this, right? This is, again, it could be a moral obligation, right? A moral responsibility that you're signing this, or there are times where those kind of documents, if, for example, a community has had it go through a lawyer and there's actual legal language in there that you're now signing onto and agreeing. Those are more of the exceptions and not the standard yet, but that is happening more and more. And so we start to see where ideas around what that moral responsibility of a researcher is, we can now see it starting, not where it needs to be yet, but starting to creep into that realm of how people can actually hold their feet to the flame, right? And be held truly accountable. And so there are examples of this happening kind of globally in the mainstream. It's not there yet. But you do start to see where we're starting to bring these two sides kind of together in a sense. And so that's a direction a lot of folks are pushing for, as to how can we now make these kinds of agreements that are more value-based, that are more based on principles. How can you make that as, say, solidified as this informed consent form that came from your institution? That kind of make sense. So, it's like that's kind of a direction we can see it going in. And, and I really appreciated, Dorji, the story you shared in the discussion forum about kind of how you were able to transform your research in a lot of ways, of moving from, kind of coming in with really this outside perspective and translating it into, well, what really more mattered for the community, and kind of that learning process that you went through. And really, really appreciated that sharing. And so I want to share with everyone kind of thinking about where we're going with this. We have a few more minutes left, and I know next week is spring break, so I won't be seeing you online, but I wanted to kind of talk through for a few minutes where we're going with all of this. But first I want to see, Maher, did you have kind of thoughts to share kind of in thinking through all of that?
Yes, I think after what you said, for me, it's more like responsibility in the countries where people or like communities, they don't know a lot about their rights when it comes like to research. And this is like one of the things that is missing from some communities, especially if we talk about this kind of participatory research and how like the people they understand what they will benefit and what is like the privilege they have as community. So they need to know that they are a real partner in this kind of the research, and they are not just like I don't know, object where people they take all the data they need and then they go wherever they want. So this is like something that is like maybe very important. And even sometimes when you watch some TV shows, even people they don't understand that they will be showed on TV shows or something, and that million of people will watch them. So they got surprised when find themselves on TV, and even like the person who is like making like the video is not telling them anything about this. So this is why I asked this question and why I shared those kind of reflection with the group earlier, because honestly, I still see a lot of unethical things in this world. So this is like what made me like thinking like that, yeah.
And I'm so glad you brought that up with also the idea of that often people don't know their own rights. They don't even know what they can be asking for, because this has become such a normal endeavor of, oh, okay, people come in and they do research and they just take that and they go. And so sometimes because it's become the norm, it's not even necessarily questioned as, okay, do I actually have rights in that situation? And just countless stories over. I mean, I have so many friends who, I mean, they've been walking through a museum and they've seen their own information, right? Or been, like, their grandkid is watching a show and say, hey, that's you, Nana, like, and all of a sudden you're on TV, and this happens all the time. And because of that people just take that as, okay, that's just what happens, and not thinking about what rights do we actually have. And so that's what a lot of this is too. It's getting to shift that narrative, right? That there are rights that people can stand up for. And so I really, really appreciate that framing. And so speaking of consent, so in just a couple of weeks here, we're going to start working towards where you're going to be developing kind of research proposals for this course. As part of that, I'm going to be asking you to develop both an informed consent as well as a declaration of kind of a guideline of principles. This is going to be like a little bit false in the sense of really the point of doing that guideline of principles would be that you're doing it in, like, with the community and engaging together. And so this is going to be more of a practice in a sense of thinking about, okay, moving beyond just this informed consent form. It's more trying to get you to think about, if I was developing this guideline principles, like, with community, like what kinds of things might come up, so because we're doing this not in like real actual carrying it through timeline context. So it's kind of going through that. So it's not the expectation for this course that you're actually developing it, with folks in real time. But it's more trying to get us to think about that kind of process, if you will. And so where we're going with this is there's in your assignment instructions, so that the next kind of thing I'm asking you to do that we're going to build towards is doing this semi-structured interview that is on a topic that you're thinking about for your research proposal. And so this isn't feeding into your research. It's for kind of, it's to have the practice of doing this for doing the interview, but then also for that we'll practice taking segments of that to practice how to code, how to do kind of that qualitative analysis. And so for this, because we're doing it a little bit, not in that as much of that participatory way of like communities that you'd really be engaging with, that I'm asking you to do it with someone who is, a family member or a close friend, that you're not just going out and meeting someone down the street for the first time and asking them to engage in this. So the expectation is that someone you're doing this with, you already have a trusted relationship with. And that's going to be really critical. And so you'll have kind of for just this process, which is different from developing a research proposal, just for doing this interview, I've drafted up just kind of a informed consent form that you'll fill in. That's really articulating, you're doing the interview in the context of this course. And to build up to that, kind of where we're going after spring break, is for the week after spring break, that the class session on the 15th is I'm asking you to have submitted that Monday ideas for research questions for your research proposal that you'll be writing for this course. And so for the idea is to submit that Monday after spring break, your research, kind of draft research question or questions, and that you're going to come to class that Thursday, and we're going to kind of workshop these around. And that's where we're going to start to think about and help each other of, okay, I have the question, it's this big, how do I break it down, right? To get it kind of to a scope that it could be done. And so the first step of this process will be getting those, the drafts of those research questions in. We'll be talking through that in class. And then thinking about what are, if you're going to do, a semi-structured interview on this topic, what are some interview questions you might have, right? And we're going to draft out those questions that you'll submit. And again, we'll talk through that in class and kind of go through each other's questions. And then basically from April 22nd to May 6th is when you'll be expected to do one interview. And the idea is to bring a segment of that transcribed interview to class on May 6th, so that that's where we'll practice kind of doing the coding and text analysis to get more into kind of how to do that kind of qualitative analysis. And so I'll just show you real quick here. I know we're just about out of time, but I'm going to show you on my screen, just so if you want to get a heads up or head start kind of in looking through this. Also, no expectation that I'm not saying any of this with an expectation that you're doing this at all over spring break. Take the break. I also know that, with work schedules and stuff, folks are on different timelines. And so if it's helpful to be thinking through this now to get a head start on it all. And so in the assignment instructions folder in Moodle, you'll see that there's an informed consent form. And a lot of this is the highlighted pieces are what I'll be asking you to fill out. That'll be based on kind of what the topic is that you're looking to cover. The other part that I wanted to bring to your attention is, let me reshare my screen here, is that again, in the assignment instructions folder is where you'll see the instructions for this semi-structured interview and text analysis. And so this is where, again, the week after spring break, we're going to be sharing, ideas for research questions that you have. I'll send you a reminder next week because you'll be posting that in the discussion forum that Monday. and then we'll be talking through it on Thursday Zoom session. But then using that to build, we're going to be conducting semi-structured interview again with either a family member, a close friend, or colleague. And it might, you know, they might not be the perfect person for, hey, this is the exact research question I have. You know, if there's kind of, if you might need a broader bit of thinking more kind of about, okay, what's the topic that someone might be able to speak to a bit. And again, this isn't to feed directly into your research, it's kind of to go through the practice of doing that interview, of developing those questions, doing the interview, transcribing it, and then doing the coding and text analysis together. Okay, so it kind of steps you through what that process will look like. And so I just kind of wanted to bring your attention to that if you want to look through more carefully, and then kind of be letting me know if there's any questions or concerns on any of it. And so with that, just as we're kind of closing, are there any questions or thoughts that folks have at this point? It's all clear as mud. All right, so I'll miss seeing you all next week, but have a good week off from FGU. I mean, I'll still be here working, so any questions, anything arises, just send me an email and we can always, you know, set time to talk over Zoom. And otherwise, I will see you back here in 2 weeks. All right, have a good one, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice week.
Bye.